Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So today we have Helen Keller, another very full life that was very difficult to condense into an hour and 10 minutes. So we'll see how well we can get this in here. But of course, what did I leave out last week for Mark Twain? Well, it just so happens that Mark Twain, born in 1835, the same year that Halley's Comet came by. And on his, a year before he died, he said that the Almighty must have said that these two unaccountable freaks have come in together and they must go out together. So he died April 21st in 1910, April 20th being the day that you could see Halley's Comet the best in the sky. So he came in with Halley's Comet and went out with Halley's Comet. The other thing that I was thinking of that I did not bring out, I think, much in the lecture last week was that Mark Twain was could be a rather difficult person to be around. He could be very moody, and he realized after his children had grown, his daughters had grown up, and I think after some soul searching and talks with them, he had written, "I never realized when my daughters were young that they were often afraid of me." And the daughters had mentioned that often if they were left alone with him, it could be very uncomfortable because he could be a wonderful father, telling jokes, telling wonderful stories to them, and they enjoyed it tremendously. And then when the mood hit him and he was feeling very dark and bitter and angry, they just wanted to be away from him because he could be a rather scary person in his dark moods. But now we have Helen Keller. And of course, in this picture, I have Helen Keller with Anne Sullivan because there is no story of Helen Keller without the story of Anne Sullivan as well. For some reason, everybody wanted to call her Annie Sullivan or just Annie, and I just could not bring myself to do that. In my mind, she's Anne Sullivan. So even though she was well known as Annie, I have to stick with Anne Sullivan, and that's just my particular thing. Okay, so I have a few pretty good books on Helen Keller. This first one is a children's book that I think I could recommend for young children, early grade school level. Covers her life in a generalized way for children, and I think it was nicely done. The next one I do not recommend. Marion Marsh Brown and Ruth Crone, The Silent Storm, The Story of Annie Sullivan. This is a fictionalized biography. So it's kind of like watching a TV movie of Anne Sullivan with Helen Keller. And it's melodramatic. To me, it does not give a good picture of the type of person that Anne Sullivan truly was. And so I didn't really care for it too much because of that. One of the things that I often really dislike about movies or TV movies in particular is when they try to grandstand. If the character of the movie is upset about something and they tell people off in their in a very bold way, and this is something that in this book Anne Sullivan seems to do to a number of people, and I thought, this is just cheap grandstanding that Anne Sullivan would not have done, at least not in that way. So it just bothered me. The next one, Joan Dash, The World at Her Fingertips, the story of Helen Keller. This is a book probably written for middle school kids, maybe high school. Well done. It's not fictionalized like the other one. It's well written, and I think it's emotionally set for, say, a middle school kids. There are a number of rather very dark things in the story of Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan that can be covered for young people in an appropriate way, and I think this book does that. Helen Keller, The Story of My Life. Helen Keller, being a very intelligent woman, wrote her story 3 or 4 times, and she actually wrote several books, some of them being her life. Well worth reading. Very nicely done. Could be very personal. So I thoroughly enjoyed reading her writings on her life. This particular book has not only her writing, but Anne Sullivan's account as well, and with John Macy, who had for some time was married to Anne Sullivan. So there's basically 3 accounts of Helen Keller's young life in this particular edition, and they're all very nicely done. The next one, Lori Lawler, Helen Keller, Rebellious Spirit. I liked this book. This is a picture book without too many pictures to crowd it out. The one thing that I would change about this book is the subtitle, Rebellious Spirit. I don't see Helen Keller as a rebellious spirit. I see her maybe an independent spirit, a wise person, very intelligent, hardworking. There's a lot of very nice adjectives that I could give to Helen Keller. I just don't see rebellious spirit as one of them. And the last one, the full-length biography, Helen Keller, A Life by Dorothy Herman. Very in-depth, sometimes heart-wrenching, sometimes very difficult to read because of the emotional trauma of both Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan, mostly Anne Sullivan, but very well written. I'm kind of surprised that I don't see any awards that this book achieved. It should have, but very nicely done, very in-depth. So, is there anyone in this room who has not seen the movie or the play, The Miracle Worker? You haven't? And you call yourself an American? How can you live your life and not have seen that? It's amazing. But no, so when I was a kid, a young, I don't know, probably 8 or 10 years old, I saw on TV, Patty Duke, and thank you, that's the name I was trying to think of, Anne Bancroft, The Miracle Worker, just an amazing movie. And so that was my impression for many years. The Helen Keller story was The Miracle Worker, and the trouble is it ends with Helen Keller learning the language to speak with her hands, sign language, and the big breakthrough, learning water. And for years that was in my mind, that was the life of Helen Keller. Of course, when I grow up, I realized, well, wait a second. She didn't end her life at that point. That was really the beginning. And so many things I've learned along the way that, she grew up, she went to college, and a lot of wonderful things happened. But I think along with many people, their idea of Helen Keller was this young child who had this breakthrough and learned to speak. A deaf and blind child learned to speak with sign language. But there's much, much more.
What was the author of the biography, Helen Keller, alive?
You can just do that.
No.
So, born in Tuscumbia, Alabama. How many of you have visited her home in Tuscumbia? I would have thought more people would have done that. June 27th, 1880, to Captain Arthur H. Keller and Kate Adams Keller. A fairly comfortable middle-class home. Although the Mr. and Mrs. Keller were probably not very happy together. They were 20 years apart in their ages. Kate was the second wife of Captain Keller, and I think she learned early on that she had made a mistake in marrying this older gentleman, but she made the best of it. So Helen is born alert, active, intelligent, even started to speak a few words before her illness. We're not really sure what it was. Probably something like scarlet fever, could have been meningitis. There are a number of illnesses around in those days that could have done that. So she's bedridden, high fever, close to death. The doctor thought that she probably would die. But the fever broke, and within a few days they realized that this 19-month-old young child was both blind and deaf. They consulted with what experts there were in the field, and nobody offered them any hope of a cure of any sort. So they lived for the next few years, as we all know, as best they could. They were indulgent with her, did not really know how to discipline her, and so let her live as best she could. She became a very wild child, throwing temper tantrums that could be very violent. And as she got older, she was increasingly violent. And Helen herself, in her autobiography, talked about her frustrations that as a child of 6 years old, walking about blind and deaf, she realized by touching people's faces that they were moving their mouths, and she would sit between two people and she could touch their faces, and she realized that they were communicating in some way with their mouths, and she knew that she could not do that. And the frustrations because of that were incredible. And she would throw these wild fits of anger and became very miserable. So that we come to Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan was raised in a very awful, poor house. She had an alcoholic father and the mother that died. And at age 8, with her younger brother, put in this hellhole of an orphanage, which was kind of a grab bag for all kinds of people. It wasn't just an orphanage. It was a filthy, awful, rat and lice infested place. 940 people, sick, disabled, insane, criminals, and other dregs of society were put into this institution. And she was there for 6 years. Her younger brother died of some illness, right next to her, and they had been sleeping in the room full of dead people. That's where they kept them temporarily before they were sent off, and her brother died there. At 14, she was sent to the Perkins School for the blind. She was mostly blind herself. She was fortunate enough to have some sort of operations that helped her eyesight. But she went to the school at 14. Very intelligent, very hardworking young woman, graduated valedictorian at the age of 20.
From Wellesley, right?
What's that?
From Wellesley College in Massachusetts.
We're not there yet.
Oh.
Yeah. So here's Anne Sullivan as a young woman. So the Kellers are looking desperately for someone who could help them. And they were told to go to see Alexander Graham Bell, who not only had invented the telephone, but he was a lifelong advocate for the deaf. He married a deaf woman and had a school for deaf children, and so he was the guy to see. And he referred them to the Perkins Institute, who had success with a woman, Laura Bridgman, who was a deaf-blind woman, older now at 59, but she also had lost her sight and her hearing at about the age of 2. And she went to this institute, and Samuel Howe was the president at the time, leader of that school, and so Laura Bridgman was really the first breakthrough before Helen Keller. Laura Bridgman learned to do sign language and could communicate with people through that way. And so she lived at this Perkins Institute. And so Alexander Graham Bell referred them there, and the leader at Michael Anagnos recommended that Anne Sullivan be her tutor. So here's Laura Bridgman at 59. She died at 60. When Helen Keller came to visit the Perkins Institute and met Laura, it was a very tense moment. Laura, having lived her whole life at this institute, was a very prim and proper elderly woman and did not care for the rambunctiousness of Helen Keller, and was kept constantly correcting her. Don't be so forward. You don't touch. You don't kiss. You stand up straight. You don't sit on the floor. And so it wasn't a very pleasant meeting, but she did meet her. And of course, here's Helen Keller and Alexander Graham Bell. They became lifelong friends. When she first met Bell, he was one of the few people that upon meeting, she felt very comfortable with. She was still the wild child, but when they came into the room, he handed her a pocket watch for her to feel the vibrations, and she sat down in his lap, and she said that he had a very comforting presence, and they became lifelong friends, would write letters back and forth. So Anne Sullivan comes to stay with the Kellers. The deal was that she would get room and board and $25 a month. And that was a very good job in those days for Anne Sullivan. And of course, we all know the story of the battles between Anne and Helen, that Anne would not let her get away with the things that the Kellers had been letting her get away with. She's not going to grab stuff off of her plate. But those scenes of battling back and forth, trying to get her to hold a spoon to eat with, are well accounted for in these biographies. So yeah, she had to have Helen alone, and they happened to have a cottage not far away, and so they took Helen on a long trip. So Helen would not know that she's coming right back home to stay in this cottage. They rearranged the furniture so that she wouldn't recognize it, and they spent 2 weeks together alone, with the Kellers coming to see them pretty much every day, but not letting Helen know that they're coming to see her. And they made great strides. Helen was tamed somewhat and a little more disciplined. And she was learning the American Sign Language, all the letters of the alphabet. And so Anne would hand her something, a doll, D-O-L-L, and make her spell it out in her hand before she gave it to her. Cake, C-A-K-E, same thing. And would do this over and over again. And Helen would very dutifully do this. She realized very quickly, and did, that Helen was highly intelligent, had a wonderful memory for these things, and learned the alphabet very quickly, seemed to take it on very naturally. And so she could do this. She'd go over and over again, all these different things that she would have Helen do for the various objects in her world. And it was very casual, something that Helen could do, but never really realized what she was doing. And then, of course, the big breakthrough was water. When Helen, at the pumping out the water, and her hand having the water flow through it, all of a sudden she realized what she was doing. And Helen dropped to the ground and patted on the ground. What is this? And then just went through everything. What is this? What is this? What is this? And it was the great breakthrough that Anne was waiting for. And once she realized that everything had a name, she wanted to know the name of everything. And it was an incredible experience, that breakthrough. And then, of course, she touches Anne and basically saying, what are you? Or who are you? And Anne spelled out teacher. And it's kind of a curious thing that for the rest of her life, she called her teacher and not Anne. Anytime she referred to her, it was as if her name was teacher. So Helen wanted to know what everything around her was named. She would learn dozens of words every day, and she just couldn't get enough. They would go for long walks in the woods, and she would learn all the different plants, both by their name and by their smell. And it became such an obsession with Helen that her parents were concerned that she would rather spell than eat. She didn't care about anything but learning what everything was. And even in her sleep, Anne would notice that she's doing the signals, the hand, the spelling out of all the things that she had learned that day. And of course, she had to learn Braille. There was no set standard at the time. There was actually 5 different types of Braille, and she learned them all because there was no one set of marks that everyone agreed on at that time. So there's, in the various books that I have, there's a bit of a disagreement as to what her first letter was, but she noticed that Anne Sullivan was writing things down, putting them in envelopes and sending them off to people. She had a correspondence with several different people. And so Helen wanted to do that too. She wanted to write letters. So she wanted to write a letter to her uncle. And in one book that I have, it says that this was the first letter that Helen ever wrote to her uncle. Puppy, mother dog 5, baby cry, hot, sunfire bad, Frank come, Helen kiss Frank, strawberries good. And this was something that she did completely on her own without even Anne Sullivan knowing. And of course, she learned Braille very quickly. I said before, a remarkable memory for many things. Now this is the letter that in another book, the author says, this is the first letter that Helen ever wrote. She had block letters that she could lay out and trace over so that she could write basic English. So this is in another book that I have says that this is the first letter. Helen write Anna, George will give Helen apple. Very good. Simpson will shoot bird. Jack will give Helen stick of candy. Doctor will give Mildred medicine. Mother will make Mildred new dress. So one of those is her first letter. This is apparently the first one that you can look up online and see. And the news gets out. Anne Sullivan is corresponding with the Perkins Institute, and they want this publicized. They want this as their crowning success. So the papers are picking this up. The 8th wonder of the world, the deaf blind girl. And the stories, of course, in the newspapers have to be way beyond the reality. So Helen could speak normally like any other person. She could play the piano. She could read minds. She could touch things and know the color of them just by touching them. And of course, most important, she was pure as the driven snow. She was a young girl who had no selfish thoughts whatsoever, and the nicest person ever to live. And so she became a worldwide phenomenon, and her letters that Anne Sullivan would send to the Perkins Institute, they would send to the papers, and her letters also were published. So Helen, or Anne, I should say, is getting tired of Tuscumbia. She believes that Helen needs a more formal education. She wants to get out of Alabama because she's finding it boring. So they travel up to Boston with several stops on the way, one of which is in Washington, D.C., where they meet President Grover Cleveland, and they are introduced. And one of the things that I tried to do online is to find pictures of Helen Keller with all the various presidents, because apparently she met every president from Grover Cleveland up to Kennedy.
Wow.
I don't know that she met Johnson or Nixon, which she could have. But apparently she met every single president, but I couldn't find pictures of every single president with her. So I just kind of left that out. So Anne Sullivan is the personal tutor at the Perkins Institute. Kept her pretty much separate from the other students. Little interactions, but not a lot. They worked furiously together. They very, very hardworking, and at sometimes at peril to both of their health. It was an excessive sort of thing, and Anne Sullivan, as we learn, was kind of an excessive person. The horrific upbringing that she had was with her all of her life, and she suffered terribly from mood swings, depression, and that sort of thing. But she was always a very hardworking dutiful tutor for Helen.
How much older was she from Helen?
So she was 20 when she first started with Helen. Helen was 7. So there's this one incident that I wasn't sure I wanted to bring this up, but for Helen, in her writing of it, it had a really big impact in her life at the time, a very traumatic experience because of the accusations. So she wrote a story that she thought was original with her and sent it to the Perkins Institute, and they thought, wow, this is a wonderful little story, The Frost King. And they published it. They sent it to the newspapers and it was published. And then someone found out it was not original with Helen. It was a story that had already been published that someone had read to Helen. And for the life of her, Helen could not remember that story that someone else had read to her. And she said over and over again that I've never heard that story. I made it up myself. But as it turns out, it was a story that was already published. And so she comes off now publicly as a fraud. And people are now wondering, well, what should we think of Helen? Is this whole thing just made up? So it was very embarrassing. It was humiliating. So for some time, she decided that she just could not write anything because she couldn't trust herself. She never did remember, although someone else finally dug up that story and realized that, they had read this to her. So after the Perkins Institute, she goes to the Wright Humason School, and she's going to learn how to speak here. This is something that Anne Sullivan had already started with her, but this is the school that specializes in teaching deaf and blind, or the deaf especially, to speak. And this was something that Alexander Graham Bell was really big on. For a long time, there is the debate, should deaf people learn to speak and read lips, or should they learn sign language? And this really wasn't settled until the 1980s. The great debate, many people, many advocates for the deaf would say we should not teach them sign language. They should learn how to speak, and they should learn how to read lips. And that debate went on for 100 years until the 1980s. It was finally settled pretty much that no, we need to teach them sign language. But anyway, at this school, they taught deaf people how to speak. Sign language was not allowed. So she met Mark Twain, hears about Helen Keller. They go to see Mark Twain, and he's enthralled with her, thinks she's wonderful, and he makes sure that her bills are paid, that she can get an education, because he had contacts with several very wealthy men, and so he helped out in that way. So she was there 1894 to 96. They did not help her very much. And they find out later that they probably hindered rather than helped her vocal abilities to speak. And here's Helen Keller and Mark Twain. I was trying to find a better photograph of the two. There's several online that you can use, but none of them are very clear. So Helen has ambitions in life. She does not want to just sit at home and be another Laura Bridgman who spends her life by herself doing knitting or sewing. She wanted to go to college. She wanted to earn a degree. And so she went to Cambridge for Cambridge School for Young Girls, young ladies, to prepare for Radcliffe. She wanted Harvard, of course, but Harvard doesn't allow women. You have Radcliffe for that. At first, they said, well, it will take about 5 years to prepare for Radcliffe, and so that was the goal. Then Anne decided, no, we could do it in 4. And then she decided, no, we can do it in 3. And so they would work to exhaustion. They had several tutors in the various subjects, but they would work to exhaustion, both Anne and Helen, and their health suffered because of it. Anne's probably especially, because she was never a very healthy person to begin with, never healthy physically or emotionally, and it took a great toll on her. And on a number of occasions, the Kellers thought that Anne was not good for Helen because they were working too hard, and came very close to firing her, but she survived. So she enters Radcliffe in 1900. Studied at a frantic pace. She wanted to make friends with various other students at Radcliffe. Very few could she ever really reach out to. Even though she was voted vice president of her class, there was very few students would bother to learn the sign language, and only one professor would. She did have several tutors, though, who helped her with her various subjects. And I think back to my college days, and I'm just amazed at what she could learn in so short a time. She pretty much mastered German, French, Greek, Latin, 4 languages that she could read fairly fluently with. And I'm thinking, you know, one consolation that I have is that I'll never have an emotional breakdown because of too much studying in my college days. But I could never do that, sadly. But yeah, she talked about in her autobiography, she could talk about reading the classics in German and French, reading Caesar's commentaries in Latin, reading the New Testament in Greek.
Oh, wow.
Were these all in Braille?
Yes, in Braille. But yeah, Braille in Latin, Greek, French, German, and English. So yeah, truly amazing. And that, in addition to all the other subjects that she had to learn, the one subject that she had a great difficulty with was math. She could never really get algebra or geometry. Just very difficult time. She was great with languages, but math was not something that came easily to her. Probably the only thing. So while she was at Radcliffe, the Ladies' Home Journal decided they wanted her story and would pay her $3,000 to do it. So in addition to all of her studies, she started writing her story. And she was helped by a talented young writer, John Macy. And there's John Macy with Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan. So Helen Keller graduates cum laude. Anne Sullivan was very disappointed.
Oh.
She did not graduate summa cum laude. But, you know, that's the break sometimes. And she was the first deaf and blind person to receive a bachelor's degree. And at this point, just before graduation, they bought a 7-acre farm in Wrentham, Massachusetts, and still did not know at this point what she would do with her life as a career. Many people thought, and she thought, well, maybe it could be as a writer, because she's already been paid for not just her life story, but many articles that she would write for various publications. So at 24, Helen Keller, as I say, I never thought of her as a rebellious spirit, but she was remarkably an independent-minded person. For in spite of the great dependency she had with Anne Sullivan, she could think for herself. She believed in a Christian mysticism as a follower of Swedenborg from the 18th century. She would correspond with many people, many famous people like Alexander Graham Bell, Mark Twain, and others, and one of which was a follower of Swedenborg, and they would write back and forth about some of the writings of this man, and so she clung to that really for the rest of her life as her religion. Alexander Graham Bell, in her periodic visits with him, encouraged her to think in romantic terms. Someday you will want to marry. And I think that would be a wonderful thing if you found the right guy and married him and had a family. And at the time, she thought, well, maybe possibly, but I'm not really interested at this time. Now with John Macy getting romantically involved with Anne Sullivan, John Macy was a socialist radical and started influencing Helen in that direction, much to the chagrin of Anne Sullivan, who was not at all a socialist or a radical politically. So she was learning more and more about communism and socialism in general. Once she graduated, she goes to St. Louis for the World's Fair, and they have the Helen Keller Day. One of the things that I'm leaving out, one of the many things I'm leaving out somewhat in this, are the many public appearances that she has throughout her life. There's just far too much there to cover at any depth. So I just can't do it. I just want to make note of this is one of many things that many times that Helen Keller is making a public appearance and is being gawked at by thousands. And she generally enjoyed that sort of thing, meeting people and enjoying these outings. So in May of 1905, Anne Sullivan marries John Macy. Unfortunately, neither one of them were suited for marriage. John Macy, a very radical sort of person, loved living off of other people. Even though he was a talented writer himself, he became kind of a sponge to Anne and Helen, and they never really got along. It was a stormy relationship from the start. He was somewhat jealous of Helen because Anne was so obsessed with Helen and kind of had to be. She was Helen's eyes and ears and would take her to various appearances in public and had to be with her all the time, almost. And so that was a bone of contention between the two of them. And of course, as I said, Anne was a very unhealthy person, both physically and emotionally. And her depression was very difficult to handle for John Macy too. So they had this on and off relationship. After 10 years, they separated for good, but never divorced. Anne Sullivan would not divorce him, and even though he asked for it. But back to Helen. I just wanted to give kind of an overview on her amazing senses. She could tell many different people that she knew by their walk and their smell. If someone walked into the room that she was familiar with, she could tell by the vibrations who that was. If they were close enough to her and she could smell them, she knew who that was. One man she knew, before she even met him in person, she smelled the tobacco on the letter that he would send to her. And so when he came into the room and she smelled that, she knew who that was. She could tell many people their occupation by their smell. If you worked with wood, you smelled like wood. If you were someone who worked, say, in the oil field, you smelled like oil. If you worked with horses, you smelled like horses, and on and on. Many people, she knew their occupation that way. And she could tell people's emotions also by their breathing. If she was close to them and she was touching them, which she often did, and she would read lips, by the way. She could touch a person's mouth, and if the person did not know how to do sign language, she would often sit with them, touch their mouths, and they could speak, and she could read their lips that way, and she knew what they were saying. But she could also tell what emotional state they were in, how they were breathing, the feel of their skin, if they were trembling at all. She was very in tune with that. And being someone who had taken many trips out into the wilderness with Anne, she knew innumerable plants by their smell, even mushrooms. She knew many different mushrooms by their smell. There was a story of once she was sitting at the kitchen table having a meal with her family, and she started laughing. And everybody was looking at her thinking, what in the world is she laughing at? Well, apparently she was the only one who noticed that in the kitchen, the cook was doing a jig. And she could feel that vibration. And it was funny to her. Here the cook is dancing in the kitchen. And so that made her laugh. So in 1909, she took voice lessons from a singing coach. And he let her know that the earlier lessons that she had when they were trying to teach her to speak had done more harm than good. She had not developed her vocal cords correctly, and they had damaged her ability to make the sounds that she needed. So for a few years, this singing coach would teach her how to use her voice correctly. Never succeeded as well as she had hoped, but he helped somewhat. In 1910, Helen has her eyes removed. The reason being, her left eye had always bulged out of her sockets somewhat, and it looked bad. If you take a look at pictures online of Helen, it's always, as a young Helen, it's always a profile, or almost always. You'll see the right side of her face. You will not see the left side because of that eye. So in 1910, she has that corrected, and she has glass eyes put in. So here, I really want you to see this.
When I saw Helen Keller first, she was 6 years and 8 months old. She had been blind and deaf and mute since her 19th month as a result of an illness. She had no way of communicating with those around her except a few imitative signs that she had made for herself. A push meant go, pull meant come, and so on. She had observed that we did not use the hands when we were talking to each other. And I let her see, by putting her hand on my face, how we talk with our mouths. She felt the vibration of the spoken word. Instantly she spelled, "I want to talk with my mouth." That seemed impossible. But after experimenting for a time, we found that placing her hand in this position, the thumb resting on the throat, right at the larynx, the first finger on the lips, the second on the nose, we found that she could feel the vibration of spoken words. For instance, the throat, she feels the G, the hard G, the. And on the lips, she feels and the K sound. On the lips, she feels the B, and with the second finger on the nose, the nasal sound, the The first word she learned to articulate was the little word "it." With the hand in this position, I made the vowel "I." She felt it. I. Then I made the T. She feels it with the finger on her lips, on my lips. Then I put the two letters together to form the word "it," and the first word was learned. After her seventh lesson, she was able to speak the sentence word by word. I am not dumb now.
Isn't that something? There are a number of YouTube videos that you can look up of Helen Keller speaking. It's not pretty, and that was probably the best that you'll hear from her, but she could speak. And Helen's eyes. So I showed you this picture earlier. If you look at her left eye, it's kind of bulging. And so all of the pictures, or virtually all of the pictures of a young Helen Keller, you'll only see her right side. And this is Helen Keller afterwards. Very pretty eyes, but they're glass. So they are in need of money. They do have a stipend from the Carnegie Foundation, and she does get some money from her writings, but she still needed money, especially since John Macy was still sponging off of them. So they would travel on the road, giving lecture tours, and to mixed results. Sometimes they would make decent money, other times the proprietor of the hall that they were using would cheat them. And so it was very difficult. But she generally did like traveling on the road and giving these tours and meeting new people. But she also was giving lectures. So they would do kind of an act where, again, she's showing how she taught Helen Keller how to speak. And people were very interested in that. But Helen Keller would also bring up social issues of the day. She was, of course, a suffragette, fighting for women's rights to vote. She spoke out on child labor laws, infant blindness. In those days, many children were born blind because of sexually transmitted diseases. That was something that people did not talk about back in those days. And any doctor nowadays will tell you it's a very simple thing. If a child is born to a woman with a disease, you wash the eyes. And now it's common practice. Every time a child is born, you wash their eyes. If you don't, and that woman has a gonorrhea or some other sexually transmitted disease, they might go blind because of that. And so she would bring that up. Yes?
The guy who invented the nitrate solution was Barnes, of the Barnes collection. That's how he made all the money to buy all that great art.
Oh, really?
Oh.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, and Helen Keller was out on the road telling people about this, and even many doctors wouldn't even know because it was not publicized, because in Victorian times you don't talk about those naughty sorts of things, those sexually transmitted diseases. And of course she would speak about the issues of poverty. She was promoting socialism, and those were the things that sometimes were not quite as what people were thinking of when they went to listen to Helen Keller. So Helen Keller had one brief love affair, a tragic one that was never brought to its final conclusion as she hoped. Anne Sullivan, in one of her several bouts of physical and mental stress, went off to Lake Placid to recover. And so Helen is living with her mother. She has a replacement secretary, Peter Fagan. He had fallen in love with her and sat with her one day and said that we should get married. And Helen was thrilled. And over several days and weeks, they would have secret meetings together. And so he goes off to get a marriage license, and he is found. They had been seen in public, and it was brought out that he had applied for this license, and it was published in the papers. And so Helen's mother is outraged. I don't like this guy, first of all, because he's another one of those radical socialists. But secondly, and more importantly, you are a disabled person. You should not marry. Disabled people, especially women, must remain virgins, remain pure. This is still the Victorian holdover of this purity myth of women especially, that women should never be tainted with sexual desires, wanting to be with men. A disabled woman needs to remain pure in the public eye. And so her mother was absolutely enraged that she would think of such a thing, and prevented her from seeing him, kicked him out of the house. He was no longer the secretary, and did everything she could to keep the two from seeing each other. They did send messages back and forth somehow, and a number of times they tried to elope. One time she actually packed her bags and went down to the front porch and waited for him. He did not show up because on a number of earlier occasions, he was met with a gun in his face.
Oh.
And so he finally gave up and was not going to marry her after all. Very sad thing. She kind of took it stoically and just said it was a wonderful experience while it lasted, and but maybe it just wasn't meant to be, and I'm still probably better off that I didn't have this marriage. So after World War I, which as a socialist, radical socialist, she was ardently against and spoke out against the imperialist powers in this world war. But after the World War, Hollywood came calling and said that they would want to make a movie of her life, Deliverance. And you could look this up on YouTube. It is one of the worst movies you've probably ever seen. The producer, directors thought of her life, were putting it together for the film, and they thought, you know what, your life is too boring. We need to spice it up a bit. So they threw in all kinds of crazy allegorical creatures to make this not just her life, but an allegory of life in general. And it was a monstrosity that cost way too much and was a total flop. Didn't make any money. So she goes on the road again in a vaudeville act, kind of like her lecture tours, only she was, I think, guaranteed the money this time instead of being cheated as often as she was earlier. So she's traveling with singers, dancers, trained animals, and really enjoys it. And Sullivan does not, but she knows that they need the money. So she goes on and does her 20-minute act showing people how she taught Helen Keller how to speak, and did fairly well. In 1923, she becomes the spokesperson for the American Foundation for the Blind. And this is finally something that she could settle down with, and something that's a lot more stable. And she received a regular salary from, and she would travel the country raising money for the Foundation for the Blind. But Anne, of course, always being somewhat unhealthy, first went to Puerto Rico after being at Lake Placid that she didn't like. For 4 months, she really enjoyed it. One of the few times in her life that she really had a good time. But came back, traveled with Helen as a very dutiful helper. And by 1930, again, she was losing her sight. She was frequently ill and depressed, and gradually replaced by her secretary, Polly Thompson. She died October 6th, 1936, at 70 years old. Heart failure was the official reason, but she was basically, like I said, a very unhealthy person throughout her life. And here's Helen's new helper, Polly Thompson. She became a world traveler. Even before World War II, she traveled to Japan to raise money for the blind in Japan. And they were absolutely crazy about her. They loved to see her. They thought she was wonderful. And of course, during World War II, she would travel the army hospitals, especially going to see the blind, the men who had lost their sight in the war. Visited 36 countries over the next several years, raising money for the disabled. Her helper, Polly Thompson, died March 21st, 1960, and replaced by a wonderful person, Winifred Corbally, and then met Patty Duke, who had played her, of course, in The Miracle Worker, and they had an enjoyable walk and talk together She retired from public life in 1961, died June 1st, 1968 from heart failure. So here's Helen Keller and Patty Duke. Patty Duke later said that she was absolutely amazed at how cheerful and jolly Helen Keller was as a person, and thoroughly enjoyed spending time with her. And I am done on time. Any questions? Okay. So this is the last, yes?
How many books do you have in your own personal library?
I really don't know.
Thousands.
Yeah,
I bet.
several thousand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good for you.
You know, some people collect very odd things. I collect books, and I truly enjoy just having them. Of course, I'll enjoy it more when I'm settled in my new house.
Yes.
And can put them back on shelves again. Right now they're in boxes still, and it's a pain in the rear end. But yeah, I get a thrill just looking at the walls and seeing all those books out there.
Thank you for sharing everything.
Thank you, thank you. So in case you're wondering, my next series will be on colonial Americans, famous colonials in the spring. So.